Picture this. It's early Tuesday morning in Ottawa. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man who once steadied the Bank of England through the wreckage of the 2008 financial crisis and guided the Bank of Canada through one of the most turbulent periods in its history, picks up his phone and calls the President of the United States. Not to complain, not to plead, to correct the record. Because the night before, Donald Trump had gone on Truth Social and threatened to block the opening of a bridge that Canada had already built, already paid for, and that was already sitting fully constructed, stretching 1.5 miles of gleaming cable-stayed steel over the Detroit River, waiting to carry 8,000 trucks a day between Windsor and Detroit. Canada had spent more than 4 billion Canadian dollars building it. And now the President of the United States was threatening to keep it closed, over a series of claims that were, point by point, demonstrably false. What followed in the hours and days after that post is one of the most striking collision points yet between the Trump administration's aggressive use of economic pressure and the quiet, methodical defiance of a Prime Minister who has been clear from his very first days in office that Canada does not bend. Let's get into all of it. To understand what is happening here, you have to understand Mark Carney, because he is not the kind of political figure Donald Trump is used to dealing with. Carney is not a career politician who climbed up through town halls and party fundraisers. He is a Harvard-trained economist who spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs before going into public service. He served as Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, guiding the country through the global financial crisis with a steadiness that drew international attention. He then became Governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. Only the second non-Briton in the bank's more than 300-year history to hold that post. He is not someone who is easily rattled by pressure, and he is certainly not someone who doesn't understand the language of economic leverage. He became Prime Minister of Canada in March 2025 after winning the Liberal Party leadership, and then led his party to a fourth consecutive electoral victory in April 2025. His pitch to Canadians was remarkably direct. He intended to reduce Canada's economic dependence on the United States, diversify trade across 4 continents, and meet Trump's coercion with something Trump hadn't expected: a firm, principled, and extremely well-informed pushback. His first major international moment came in January 2026 at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Standing before a room full of world leaders and business elites, Carney delivered a speech that became the most talked-about address of the entire gathering. He declared that the rules-based international order, the framework of alliances and mutual obligations that had governed global affairs since the Second World War, had experienced what he called a rupture. Not a transition, a rupture. He told the audience that great powers were now using economic integration as a weapon, and that middle powers like Canada had a choice: compete against each other for the favour of larger powers, or band together to create a third path. His line, "Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu," drew a standing ovation. Leaders from Finland, Australia, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte lined up to praise it. You need to understand what the Gordie Howe International Bridge actually is before you can fully appreciate how strange and revealing Trump's attack on it turned out to be. The bridge is named for Gordie Howe, the Saskatchewan-born hockey player who spent 25 years with the Detroit Red Wings, won 4 Stanley Cup titles, and became one of the most beloved sports figures in North American history. When asked what he thought of the honour of having a bridge named after him, Howe reportedly said simply, "That sounds pretty good to me." He died in 2016, 2 years before construction began. The bridge itself is a 1.5-mile cable-stayed crossing over the Detroit River, connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan. Its main span, the distance between its 2 support towers, is the longest of any cable-stayed bridge in North America. Its design, with the cables fanning out from the towers in a sweeping arc, is meant to evoke the hockey sticks of the man it honours. When it opens, it will be the 3rd major crossing between Detroit and Windsor, alongside the ageing Detroit-Windsor Tunnel and the privately owned Ambassador Bridge, which has served as the main commercial artery between the 2 countries for nearly a century. And that word, commercially, is where things get serious. The Windsor-Detroit corridor is the busiest trade crossing between Canada and the United States. About 1/4 of all annual Canada-US trade passes through it, most of it on the backs of trucks. Auto parts manufactured in Windsor cross the river to be assembled in Detroit. Finished vehicles cross back. Steel, aluminium, farm products, consumer goods. The supply chains of 2 of the world's largest trading partners run directly through this stretch of river. The Detroit Regional Chamber called the Gordie Howe Bridge the most consequential infrastructure project in the state of Michigan, and they weren't being dramatic. When COVID-era protesters shut down the Ambassador Bridge for several days in 2022, it sent shockwaves through the North American automotive supply chain almost immediately. The new bridge was built precisely to end the vulnerability of depending on a single, privately owned crossing for that volume of commerce. Construction began in 2018. The Canadian government funded the entire project, which totaled roughly $4.7 billion US, or about 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, on the understanding that it would recoup the cost over 30 years through tolls. Under the Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement signed in 2012, the bridge would be publicly owned jointly by Canada and the state of Michigan, with oversight shared equally between representatives from both governments. Michigan gets half of everything. After Canada recoups construction costs, toll revenues split straight down the middle. By early 2026, major construction was complete. Testing was underway. The bridge was fully connected to Interstate 75 on the Michigan side and Highway 401 on the Ontario side. It was, as Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkins put it, fully constructed and fully connected to the interstate systems on both sides of the border. An opening was expected within months. And then Donald Trump logged onto Truth Social on a Monday night in February. Just over 300 words. That's all it took to turn a near-complete infrastructure triumph into an international incident. Trump's post opened with the claim that Canada had treated the United States very unfairly for decades. It then moved to the bridge, where he stated flatly that Canada owned both the Canada and the United States side, which, as you now know, is incorrect. Michigan owns half. That's been the legal arrangement since 2012, confirmed in black and white in the Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement, confirmed by Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office, confirmed by the Windsor Mayor, confirmed by the former Republican governor who helped negotiate the deal in the first place. Trump then claimed the bridge had been built with virtually no US content and blamed Barack Obama for granting a waiver that allowed Canada to sidestep the Buy American Act. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's response to this was characteristically blunt. 75% of the steel and concrete used in construction was Canadian, because Canada was paying for it. but 25% came from American suppliers, and the interchange work on the Michigan side, the road connections, the port of entry, the customs facility, was built entirely by American workers with American steel and American concrete. Thousands of US union workers had jobs because of this project. Trump then pivoted to Ontario's ongoing ban on American alcohol products from provincial liquor shelves, a retaliatory move that Ontario had implemented in response to US tariffs on Canadian goods, and then veered into a complaint about Canada's trade discussions with China. And here is where the Post took a turn that most people still can't quite believe actually happened. Trump wrote that if Prime Minister Carney proceeded with a trade deal with China, the consequence would be that China would terminate all ice hockey being played in Canada and permanently eliminate the Stanley Cup. There is, to be clear, no mechanism by which a Canadian trade deal with China could result in the elimination of ice hockey or the Stanley Cup. The Stanley Cup is administered by the National Hockey League, a private organisation headquartered in New York. China has no authority over Canadian hockey, the NHL, or any related institution. The claim was so untethered from reality that multiple journalists noted it in their fact checks simply to confirm that yes, the President of the United States actually wrote that. Trump concluded with the ultimatum. He would not allow the bridge to open until the United States was fully compensated for everything we have given them, and until Canada treated the US with the fairness and respect that we deserve. He declared that the United States should own, perhaps, at least one half of this asset, seemingly unaware that Michigan already does. What Trump did not mention in his post was something a former Canadian Member of Parliament put simply to CNN. During his first term, Trump himself had signed a joint statement with then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in February 2017, calling the Gordie Howe Bridge a vital economic link between our two countries and urging its expeditious completion. His own administration had placed the bridge on a list of 50 high-priority US infrastructure projects. Trump 1.0 wanted this bridge finished. Trump 2.0 wanted to hold it hostage. Here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the question that immediately followed Trump's post was the same one that tends to follow a lot of Trump's most specific targeted attacks. Who told him to do this? The answer emerged within 24 hours, reported by the New York Times and confirmed by multiple officials briefed on the situation. On the Monday that Trump posted his Truth Social broadside, Matthew Moroun had a meeting with US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington. After that meeting, Lutnick spoke to Trump by phone. The post appeared on Truth Social shortly afterward. Matthew Moroun is the chairman of the Detroit International Bridge Company, the corporation that owns and operates the Ambassador Bridge, the very crossing that the Gordie Howe Bridge would compete with directly once it opened. The Moroun family has been in this fight for a very long time. Moroun's father, the late Manuel Matty Moroun, bought the Ambassador Bridge in 1979 and turned it into a private revenue machine as cross-border trade exploded through the 1980s and 1990s. When Canadian and American authorities began planning a second, publicly owned crossing in the early 2000s, the Moroun family fought it at every step. They mounted legal challenges that reached the Canadian Supreme Court. They bankrolled a 2012 Michigan ballot initiative trying to restrict the state's ability to own or develop new international bridges, spending more than $30 million on that campaign alone. Voters rejected it. They placed ads on Fox and Friends during Trump's first term, specifically targeting him, asking him to revoke the bridge's construction permit. Trump didn't bite. Then. Matthew Moroun has donated more than $600,000 to Trump and Republican Party organizations. Just last year, he gave $250,000 to the Republican National Committee alone. His lobbying firm, Ballard Partners, whose founder has deep ties to Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, had 6 lobbyists working on the Ambassador Bridge Company's behalf at the time of Trump's post, the most since at least 2005. Former Republican Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, who brokered the original 2012 agreement that made the Gordie Howe Bridge possible, wrote an op-ed in the Detroit News the day after Trump's post that was unusually direct. He noted that if the bridge opening was delayed or stopped, there actually is one big winner: the Moroun family and the Ambassador Bridge Company. He called Canada wonderful for having financed the entire project. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell made the connection even more explicit on a press call, saying that people should be asking about someone who's been against this bridge from the very beginning. When asked to name names, she said yes, she was talking about the Moroun family. "I want you all to remember," she said, that they spent more than $30 million on a ballot proposal in 2012 to try to block this bridge. House Oversight Ranking Member Robert Garcia launched a formal congressional investigation into the Lutnick meeting and its relationship to Trump's post, calling it a textbook example of a billionaire donor using White House access to advance private financial interests against the public good. Against all of this, the false claims, the hockey conspiracy theories, the billionaire lobbying, the international pressure, Mark Carney did something that has become something of a signature move for him. He picked up the phone, corrected the record calmly and specifically, and described the conversation as positive. Early Tuesday morning, Carney called Trump and laid out the facts. Canada paid for the construction of the bridge. The ownership is shared between Canada and the state of Michigan, not Canada alone. The construction involved both Canadian and American workers and steel sourced from both countries. He described it as an example of exactly the kind of cross-border cooperation that benefits both countries economically. He also made sure Trump understood that Michigan's own people, thousands of union workers, had built the American side of the bridge with American materials. Ontario Premier Doug Ford made the numbers precise when speaking to reporters. 75% Canadian steel and concrete, because Canada was paying for it. 25% American steel and concrete, and the Michigan interchange, the on-ramps, the port of entry, the customs plaza, all American workers, all American steel, all American concrete. Carney told the press afterward that the conversation was productive, that he expected the situation to be resolved, and that Trump had agreed to have US Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, a Michigander, play a role in smoothing the relationship around the bridge. He described it as a great example of cooperation between our countries and said he looked forward to the opening. And then, because he is Mark Carney and apparently has a finely calibrated sense of the absurd, he told reporters that he had also informed President Trump that Canada's women's hockey team would be playing the United States that same day in an Olympic matchup, and that Canada was going to win. Ford echoed Carney's confidence about the bridge with his own particular bluntness. "Make no mistake about it," he said. "I'm very confident the bridge is going to open. It's going to open because it's in the best interest of the American economy. If President Trump didn't want it to go forward, why did he fast-track it? All of a sudden, he changed his mind, and it's not good." Michigan's political world was equally direct. Senator Elissa Slotkin said Trump was punishing Michiganders for a trade war he started. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell pointed out that the bridge connects directly to I-75, generates Michigan jobs, supports Michigan's automotive supply chains, and had been endorsed repeatedly by Trump himself in his first term. "Nothing has changed," she said. "We cannot forget Canada is our friend and ally." Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office called the bridge all about jobs and made clear they expected it to proceed. Let's step back from the noise for a moment, because there is something larger happening in this story that is easy to miss when you're tracking the daily back and forth of claims and counterclaims. Donald Trump has, throughout his second term, treated economic relationships as if they were real estate transactions, assets to be acquired, renegotiated, or leveraged for maximum personal and political advantage. He demanded Mexico pay for the southern wall. Mexico didn't. He now wants Canada to hand over ownership of a bridge that Canada already paid for. Canada won't. The pattern reveals something important. Trump's economic coercion is not a negotiating strategy with a predictable outcome. It is an improvised pressure campaign, shaped heavily by whoever has his ear at a given moment, in this case, a billionaire bridge owner who stood to profit if the competing crossing never opened. What Carney has done, repeatedly and deliberately, is refuse to play that game on Trump's terms. He corrects the facts. He frames the situation in terms of mutual benefit. He describes calls as positive, even when the other side is making demands. And then he quietly continues building alternative trade relationships on 4 continents, while making clear that Canada's sovereignty is not negotiable. The Gordie Howe Bridge sits at the centre of a quarter of all US-Canada trade. When that corridor functions smoothly, American auto workers in Michigan have jobs. American businesses receive Canadian goods. American farmers sell their products northward. The supply chains that keep North American manufacturing running thread directly through that 1.5-mile span over the Detroit River. Threatening to block the bridge doesn't just hurt Canada, it hurts Michigan, it hurts American workers, and it hands a private billionaire family a competitive monopoly they couldn't win in court or at the ballot box. The people who understand this best are not in Washington right now. They are in Windsor and Detroit, in the offices of the Detroit Regional Chamber, in the dealerships and parts plants and assembly lines on both sides of the river. The Chamber called it the most consequential infrastructure project of a generation. The automakers who depend on the Windsor-Detroit corridor have long supported it. The union workers who built it on both sides of the border supported it. Even the Republican governor who negotiated it, who the Moroun family has every reason to criticise, called Canada wonderful for having financed the whole thing. That is the bridge Mark Carney was defending on Tuesday morning. That is the phone call he made. That is the record he corrected, point by point, with the precision of a man who spent decades managing central banks through actual crises, not manufactured ones. As of this recording, the bridge remains fully constructed and awaiting its opening. The White House has not provided specifics on how exactly Trump intends to block it, because legally, practically, and logistically, blocking a bridge that is already built and already connected to the interstate highway system on both sides of an international border is not a simple thing to do. Carney has said the situation will be resolved. Doug Ford has said the bridge will open. Michigan's entire political establishment, Democrats and a surprising number of Republicans, has said the bridge serves American interests. And the congressional probe into Lutnick's meeting with Matthew Moroun is unlikely to disappear quietly. What you are watching in this moment is a broader test of whether economic coercion works when the target refuses to be coerced. Carney has built his entire political identity on the premise that Canada can stand firm, diversify its relationships, correct false claims, and engage diplomatically without capitulating. Every time Trump issues a new threat, the 51st state rhetoric, the tariffs, the Davos response, and now the bridge, Carney's response is the same: calm, factual, forward-looking, and utterly unmoved. The Gordie Howe International Bridge was named for a man famous not just for his skill, but for his physical toughness, his willingness to deliver a sharp elbow when the situation called for it, and to keep skating. There's something fitting about the fact that it has become the latest symbol of Canada's determination to protect its own interests, built with its own money, already fully standing. The bridge is there. It will open. And when it does, 1/4 of all trade between two of the world's largest economies will flow across it. Built by Canadian workers and American workers together, owned jointly by Canada and Michigan, paid for by Canadian taxpayers who simply wanted a second way across the river. That is not a story of Canada taking advantage of the United States. That is a story of two neighbours who built something together, and Mark Carney made sure Donald Trump knew it. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what's actually at stake here, not just the headlines, but the history, the money, and the people involved, hit subscribe and stay with us. There's a lot more of this story left to tell. And in the comments, I want to know, do you think the Gordie Howe Bridge opens on schedule, or does Trump find a way to delay it further? Let me know what you think.